It really is a series of conversations that Sylvia elucubrated in a series of conversations with Eric. And it was basically about pretty much what Sylvia was interested to discuss in terms of the context of certain contemporary issues that her brilliant mind is probably interested in these days. It's always tricky for me to talk or introduce somebody who I consider a personal friend, particularly one with Sylvia, which all of us, when we know her, we all have stories that we always remember if Sylvia was in the room or not in any particular conversation. But I was trying to think that the introduction is not so much about introducing Sylvia, which all of you know are familiar with, and I will leave Sylvia to introduce our distinguished guest, Liz Diller, which is a total pleasure and kind of a really an amazing luxury for us to have that possibility to have this conversation. But I wanted to talk more about the format of the notion of the conversation and the series of things that Sylvia is trying to do. And one thing occurred to me as somebody like Sylvia operates in the theory, critic, and history field, but I will say she has a much better eye than most of the designers that I know. So in a way, she operates in every possible aspect of the discipline. But at the same time, she doesn't talk, or in this conversation, like any of the canonic figures that we have, one often or not. And I was thinking, in the series of 3 movies of Francis Ford Coppola in the early 70s, The Godfather, and everybody can relate to some architects that will be like Vito Corleone, or even Marlon Brando, other character in Apocalypse Now. And this one is maybe too close to home about who would think about the horror of At the End of the River. But the one I was thinking in relation to Sylvia, in relation to this conversation, was what probably is the best movie ever done by Francis Ford Coppola, and certainly his favorite, which is called The Conversation, which it doesn't seem very clear, but he says, Harry Cole is an invader of privacy, the best in the business. He can record any conversation between 2 people anywhere. So far, 3 people are dead because of him. And I'm not saying that people die because of Sylvia, but certainly bad ideas, thank God, die because of Sylvia. So in many regards, I would say she's the best in the business of creating this conversation. But what is interesting about the movie is that he's never really the part of the conversation. He's the one listening to things in a very expert and parallel way, and thinking about it, and reflecting and passing the information to somebody else established. But what I think is really, really interesting is at the end of the movie, he became so embedded with the problem that he's working on that the obsession became something else. And he became part of the conversation, and actually, he became the conversation. So, and I'm not saying this as the best of the compliments I can think I can pay to somebody, and particularly somebody like Sylvia, which is, at the end of the day, when she does a conversation, it's not so much about the conversation itself, it's about the level of obsession and how that track into something else, which maybe was not there and so clear for us to see, and maybe takes us to destroy our whole apartment to figure it out, that what really are we listening to it, and at the end of the day, relax, take the saxophone, and play the best music you can play. So, on behalf of SCI-Arc, I think it's a pleasure to have Sylvia doing this series of talks, and of course, that pleasure gets maximized because we have Liz Diller today with her. So I welcome both. Thank you for being here.
The plan is that I'm going to make a few remarks to put the conversation in context. Then I've asked Liz to present some of the cultural/museum work that the studio is doing now for half an hour or so. Then she and I will talk for a little while, and then we'll all talk together at the end. So it's a kind of play in four acts, if you will. The idea of the conversation, of these conversations, started, as Hernan was saying, in a series of conversations I had with Eric about, sort of what next for the school. And one of the issues that I have been interested in watching is the question of how you open the school up to the outside now that it has such an internally robust culture. I think that that's an important question, and one that I think tracks a lot of different things. I mean, it's funny, you showed movies from the 70s. I was talking to Liz, you know, formed in the 70s. There are a lot of things, the school was formed in the 70s. There are a lot of, you know, radical practices of the 70s that are now all grown up and finding themselves at a certain kind of crossroads. As I told you before, the crossroads is one that I'm going to think about in relation to stock taking. But let me just remind you that normally when people take stock, they do so out of a sense of impending crisis. And for me, what's interesting is that I think that contemporary stock taking is really necessary because of a current success, maybe too much success, along the lines of be careful what you wish for. So I think hopefully Liz and I will get to the notion of success when we talk. There are a lot of different roads to success, and I've tried to curate this series of conversations with a bunch of people who represent different forms or different symptoms of success in architecture. They all are predicated on this idea of liberating the future from the past as a kind of achieved success. We talked with Beatrice Colomina last time. You know, this is a kind of hysteria of the success of architectural history. It's a kind of pornography of history, if you will, which is if you can convert the archive into orgasm, I think that you call that a form of success. Thomas Demand, who we'll talk to next time, is obviously using architecture to build forms of success. The school has forms of success, et cetera. So Liz and Rick, so I suppose if you go from their traffic cones, their installations, this is 1981, the first project for which they're credited, to, oh, I forgot my goodie bag. Wait a second. My little goodie bag. Okay, so if you go from that to this, just hot off the press, I'm giving you a book plug. This is, what? So, yeah, but that's more than, that's what I'm saying. Liz is saying this book is not their book, and she says it's about them. So by the time you're the subject of your own monograph, I mean, Jesus Christ, that's a form of success. Come on. Own up, for God's sakes. The fact that Rick has managed to keep all that hair for all of those years is another form of success. You know, they did some really crazy little things. And when you look at, this is Art on the Beach of 1983, when you look back to these kinds of things, I hope that you'll keep in mind as we move forward why I would consider talking to Liz here as a way of looking outside of architecture, because in some way this reminds us that Liz is in effect an honorary architect rather than an architect by training or by birth in some way. So if you follow these things along and they get big, they follow a certain architectural narrative, they get bigger and bigger, they take on the signs of more recognizable forms of success, if you will, and to try to toggle back to those earlier issues and what the relationship between the two might be is, I think, a subject of important inquiry. So if they started making installations, they've now made installations into icons. Those are two words that would not, in the 70s, have been able to coexist in a single sentence. So their practice really reflects a radical set of transformations in the field that are worth, as I said, taking stock of. Today, their studio really is building a cultural platform. It's building the cultural platform, almost globally redefining the terrain of culture itself. So there's lots to talk about. On a very personal level, I can't really introduce Liz without saying two personal things about her. One is the role that she may not know that she played, at least in my sort of intellectual education, which was when I was a student, and my last year as an undergraduate, I guess, in New York, tripping over those cones. Pretty much on my way to see a show at the New Museum that had the Sheila works by Sylvia Lavin. And those two things were just profoundly transformative to me. They were my first primary contact with an art that moved primarily through intelligence, and I have never forgotten them. And they are my obsession, if you will, trying to figure out what those things, the kind of hole that these projects ripped in the universe, has remained something that I work on in every way that I can still to this day. If you look at the precision of those cones, I would also just want you to know that there is nobody I know who is more precise in what she does than Liz, as a designer, as a teacher, as a thinker. Don't ever get entangled in a situation in which you're like co-writing a letter with her, because you'll be up all night long getting the comma in exactly the right place. And I wish you all the opportunity to care about what you do as much as she does. The very last thing and the most personal thing that I would say is that success takes an enormous amount of time. But Liz is that very special kind of friend that, as Marlene Dietrich said, you can call up at 4 o'clock in the morning and they're always there, and that's what matters the most. So I appreciate all of those things about you. That's what I have to say. Other than that, we'll move to your presentation and then we'll pick up the conversation when you're done. Welcome, Liz.
Okay, who's calling who a control freak? All right, so when Sylvia told me ostensibly that we're going to be talking about, oh, shit, where's my PowerPoint? Hold on. This is the worst thing, exposing somebody's desktop. No, that's not mine.
This?
Yeah. No? The other one? That's it, yeah. Okay. To get to the beginning. Yep. Oh, hold on. Okay. So, all right, so when Sylvia already forecast that we would be talking about Broad, I thought that I would back up and speak a little bit about or contextualize the Broad project in some other museums that we're doing, and actually think a little bit about kind of how we got to where we got to. And I would say that our work, because I studied art before I went to architecture, I was always interested in making things that in somehow in public space, and always looking at the museum with some suspicion, but also wishing I could get into one. That somehow the work has always been around museums, and whether the work was kind of independent stuff like the traffic cones, where we clearly didn't put that installation anywhere other than in a very, very site-specific place to speak about space. A lot of the work was guerrilla. A lot of it was very temporary. A lot of it was on credit cards, and it was and it all ended up somehow in landfill in New Jersey. That was a certain kind of body of work, and that still continues. You know, maybe not independently as it did before, but it still continues. We also did a lot of work when we were invited into the institution, to the museum, with a great self-consciousness of where we were. So from the point of view of being architects, when you step into a museum to have an exhibition of your work, you can't be innocent about it. And so there was a lot of work that we did that kind of related to the institutional critique. And we continue to do that, and we also curate shows, and so we inhabit the museum from the inside, from the point of view of the artist or the guest. And then we were invited to perhaps be the host, and so we had to do a lot of thinking. But I wanted to start the story kind of in the middle with the retrospective that we were asked to do at the Whitney. And this was in 2003. And we were very ambivalent about the idea of doing a retrospective. The notion of retro and spective, looking backwards, we thought that our work really wanted to look forwards, not backwards, but it seemed like something that one would do at the end of one's career. And at the same time, we couldn't resist the opportunity to show a lot of the work we had at the Whitney in the Breuer building. So the notion of the retrospective, it's an invention of the modern museum, and it assembles disparate works into a kind of body that's meant to provide a cohesive overview of the creative development of an artist. And our work resisted cohesion and spatial juxtaposition because it was so site-specific and place institution-specific as well. So these pieces were done at different times, different places, different hosts, and so forth. So what we wanted, we accepted this, the retrospective, but we wanted to retain some kind of critical voice in producing the retrospective itself. And there were a couple of curators involved, Michael Hayes and Aaron Betsky. But we thought we really didn't want to be curated, so that kind of produced some tensions. But anyway, we decided to make the retrospective itself the object of critical reflection. So the work was there, but we were looking at the assemblage of the work. So there was a continued interest in what the wall meant and what the white wall meant, and in museum culture, the white wall is supposed to sanitize the visual field of everything but the work of art that's on display. It's supposed to induce a kind of selective snow blindness in which the wall itself disappears. And while the white wall orders, groups, and sanctions the artworks, its featurelessness is an eloquent expression of the museum's authority to make narratives and to continually treat it as a blank slate to make new narratives. And so instead of abandoning the white wall into its background status, we decided to call it to the foreground in the retrospective. So this is the fourth floor of the Whitney, and it's subdivided into multiple galleries. It's the only thing that we were able to do. We had lots of installations, like I think 12 of them, and that were portable enough to put on display. And basically, the work itself is a kind of decoy for this Uber work that puts it all together, of which the walls that divide up the space are collaborators. So that the installation kind of sabotages the very walls that are kind of made there to divide it up. And the main player is this drill. It was just a hardware store drill. We collaborated with Honeybee Robotics that made the Mars driller to make this thing. These are the brains of the thing. And basically it's a kind of robotic system. And well, you'll see, I have a little video. It follows, here. So basically the drill goes up and down and on the shaft, and the track goes around, it wraps around 400 feet around various walls. Oh, this has sound. So an intelligent navigator maps the entire surface of the gallery walls, and then it randomly generates points within this three-dimensional matrix of the walls. And basically, it gets guided to that point, it drills a hole, and then goes to the next location. And so it just continues to do this, and who knows where it goes next. It was very difficult to make this corner detail, I have to say. So initially, when we started, there were lone holes in these walls, and they made us kind of capture the dust in a box because they didn't want it to circulate in the museum's mechanical system. So these blemishes that were first on these walls then started to cluster together, and they started to weaken the wall, and they started opening from gallery to gallery. So the acoustic and the visual kind of autonomy that we made with the walls was then acted on. So this was like a 3-month performance project, and the wall was made increasingly unstable, and then eventually the curatorial text was obliterated, and so forth. So now just moving to like another detail. This was like an acoustic and visual nuisance that just kept kind of doing its own thing, and it resisted the totalizing function of the entire show, of the retrospective itself. But we were interested in like a sub-theme inside of the wall as well. We were interested in what makes the MoMA wall, what makes the Whitney wall, and can we perhaps take a wall from another museum, or can we graft museum walls together? And what are the different whites that represent each of these museums? So we were kind of fascinated by that. And so at the same time that we were doing this project, MoMA was going through its renovation from the Pelli to the Taniguchi version. And we were really interested in finding a very particular piece of wall, and as long as they were demolishing and kind of transforming the building, could we take a chunk of wall? So we were very specifically interested in going into the permanent collection and finding the wall where this painting was basically hiding, and the painting was sitting on top of that wall for many years. And so we figured out where the painting was, and then and this is Duchamp's network of stoppages, and this was used for Bright Strip Bear, and in and of itself it was its own kind of divisive measure, very influential when I was a student, and I was very, very obsessed with this. And this has a really interesting provenance. It's Joseph Stella, 1946, sold it to Frederick Kiesler, then who sold it to Julian Levy, who was Kiesler's agent, and then went to Patricia Kane Matta, the wife of Pierre Matisse, who was the youngest son of Henri. And then it went to a private collector, and the private collector finally, from Palm Beach, donated it to MoMA. And so we were very interested in this. So we actually, this is the room, this is the gallery, and that's where the painting was. And it was actually used as a field office for the renovation that they were doing. So we were able to convince MoMA to, because it was kind of useless, to take that piece of wall. And so we brought in, we'll see in a second, we brought in a crew to extract this thing. And I'm not really sure why the New York Times was interested in this, but the guy on the right is a New York Times writer, Arthur Lubau, who decided that he was going to watch us and just observe this whole process. So we found that spot, and you know, I mean, one might ask, well, why is this important? Why would you find that piece of wall? And I think that that piece of wall has an aura to it. It was not exposed. It was hidden by that painting. That painting is in deep storage. The wall has no meaning. It's going to be destroyed. Well, but it does have some value, I thought. Anyway, so when we took this apart, we basically wrapped it and put it on a truck and brought it to the Whitney. They didn't know which side to take it in. Is this a building material or is this actually a piece of art? And that was kind of wild. Anyway, and so we ended up putting it, you know, in this wall, and you could see that the wall is wider than the Whitney, and it actually has lots of layers of paint that built up over the years. So it kind of projects out from the surface of the wall, and that was important. So anyway, so we grafted it, and so this whole guest host thing got, you know, even more and more complicated, and the programming on the for the drill, and we call this piece mural. The programming was random programming, but when the drill went over this piece of auratic Duchampian wall, it started to behave differently, in a dissident way. It started to have order, and it was kind of interesting. This thing built up over time, over the 3 months. It made some mistakes too, and then anyway, when the show was over, we took the wall, we took, you know, walls down, everything got put into trash. But I thought, well, maybe we should hold on to this little piece of the Duchamp wall. And we cut it up into 2-foot pieces and put it into storage and forgot all about it. And then a couple of years went by, and we got a call from MoMA saying that they wanted to acquire, and they knew that we had that piece of that wall, and they wanted to put it in a show, and they wanted to make an acquisition. So they put it in a show. I forgot what it was called, but anyway, and there it is. And it now it belongs to MoMA. So yeah, and this is a true story. Anyway, but I thought I would show, and then there's another part of the history of this, which is that the drill was decommissioned and put into storage, and then when Maxi opened, we decided, we were invited to do an installation, we decided to, you know, kind of recommission it to do something different. So we decided that rather than piercing a wall, it could be an etching device, and it could, by drilling into a wall different depths and dimensions, it could actually make photographic images. And so we call this drill Baby Drill, and it is, you know, it is one of the biggest environmental disasters, the BP oil spill, and basically it's that, so this is it in progress, and basically it does that. So it didn't do it so well the second time, but so then one little segue here is that, you know, our studio guys every once in a while did inspections at the show and wanted to make sure everything was functioning right, and they would occasionally find stuff in the holes. And so one day they found this note. And so, you know, it's a little bit like, you know, putting a wish in the Wailing Wall or something like that. And you know, this was at the same time that we were commissioned to do our first museum. And so I took that to heart. And so so, you know, just fast forward, the ICA, it was the first time that we actually considered what it was like to think from the point of view of the institution, or what is the role of the architect between the institution and the artist. And we saw this as a first opportunity to really kind of contemplate those issues and to really even understand things like how to make good light and how to make good space and how to make decent walls for paintings and stuff like that. So this has been widely published, so I won't describe it very much, but there was, the basic organizational strategy was that there is a big gallery and it's at the top of the building, and everything beneath it is it's public and it's social and it's less contemplative, though the space on top is contemplative. And so this is the Harbor Walk, which is like a 46-mile long a piece of reclaimed waterfront that goes right by the ICA, and so we extended this into the building and rolled it into the surface of on the underside of the gallery, and kind of produced a series of spaces. This is more kind of theatrical sheltered space overlooking the harbor, and the whole building is about, it makes a space for traditional exhibitions, but it also at every moment understands its site and it somehow tries to capture it and translate it in some way. So in the theater, through a scanning element of the elevator, it turns it entirely off in the galleries, and then in the Mediatek, it just frames down and edits everything out, but just a patch of water. So each time you have basically the museum itself is editing what it wants to, and site is very important to us. The Rio project, it's the Museum of what is it called? Museum of Image and Sound, and it's a museum of the culture of Rio. It's film culture, it's music, photography, telenovelas, comedy. It has a collection of Carmen Miranda headdresses and shoes. It's like the most incredible thing that one would ever want. Copacabana and Carmen Miranda together in one place, and it's called a museum. Anyway, it's right on the museum wall at the beach, and we tried to somehow situate this project somewhere between the public imagination of Rio, which is this kind of glamorous place with scenic beauty, hedonistic pleasures, and so forth. It's unaffected by socioeconomic conditions, but also, realistically, it's situated between favelas, and it's got very difficult problems of urbanization, and we really understood the beach as the one truly democratic site in Rio. It unifies all the different strata of the city, and it's a place of spectacle, anything from the single body, to millions of people coming together for events. The project itself takes the Burle Marx graphic pattern of the paving of the avenue, and basically it builds the whole museum out of it. It basically folds it up as a sidewalk coming up the building, which allows the beach culture to come up the building and just get to the top of the building free of charge, and take a shower along the way, and then for museum culture you can weave in and out, and the galleries are extended landings on this site. So basically it was an initial sketch and some other images here. And we realized that one of the best assets that the museum had was the view to the beach, and the facade would do something to edit the view and dispense it in very small doses. And so we're making a facade basically of these kind of controlled tubes that look at one thing or the other, and this is the top of the building. I'll just go quickly. This is the Hirshhorn. We're working on an expansion. It's kind of in the middle of the National Mall on the right. It's the donut, and it's a museum of modern and contemporary art. we are doing a temporary addition to it that is up seasonally, very much affected by our understanding of that site. It sits on the National Mall. It's a site of the expression of freedom and power of the people. Great events have happened on the mall. And the fact is that all these museums line the mall, and they're very static, and they're very, and they speak one way. They teach you. You don't speak back to them. It has very little to do with the siting of the mall and what the mall means as a site of democracy. It happens to be that there are like 500 think tanks and embassies and so forth, or just around that part of DC, and why couldn't the museum harness that intellectual energy into something to really think about cultural diplomacy and think about where art stands in relationship and the museum stands in relationship to all of that, particularly a museum that's situated on the mall. So this is the building. It's a Bunshaft building, 74. It's a concrete donut. It's levitated off the ground. It's got a big hole in the middle. Well, where would we put the addition? It kind of fit in this hole. The buildings around it are all stone and concrete. What material would this want to be? We figured it wants to be the material of the mall itself. It wants to be air. And so we think of it as a kind of inhaling of the mall into the center of the museum, which is also a void. And so this is it. Oozes out one side, and this is the section. Data cloud is a complicated thing to pull off, and it will be a forum for conversations. It's not really meant to hold art, but it's meant to have discussion. So here we are at the Broad, and after Broad I want to show one more thing. The Broad has, you all know the history of LA, and its siting on Bunker Hill is very particular. This site has a history around a kind of City Beautiful campaign to kind of concentrate all muscular buildings in the middle and really and urbanize LA. There are many different kinds of beauty that have, or images and ideas about beauty. In the end, LA resists urbanization. It can't be like all cities. It can't be like your typical city. But it did grow these monuments along Grand, and and I presume ours will be yet another monument, despite how much we wanted to drink the Kool-Aid about how to really bring the public into this place. Now it's very difficult to sit next to this building, so we had our work cut out for us. Now what do you put there? You don't have much space. You don't have a site that's as high or as wide. It's basically a box, and the program is bigger than the box. So in the end, you get a box no matter what you do. Kevin Rice is sitting here. He's the project architect. We had a horrible meeting today on this project. We're still kind of reeling, but the building is being built. But basically, I'll just a couple of things about it. We couldn't compete with that building. We couldn't even converse with the building next to us. So we decided, well, let's just make it something different. It's just the only kind of relation is ours is matte to Gary's shininess, and ours is porous to the smoothness of Disney Hall. But that's about as far as it goes. So the specific square footage issues are that this is primarily a storage facility, so it has less display space than it has storage. We've been able to change this a little bit, but still it is, and if you think about on Grand Avenue with the notion and with the desire to urbanize downtown LA, you really don't want to put a warehouse there. So the question was, if the warehouse is bigger than the museum, is the museum inside of a warehouse, or is the warehouse inside of the museum? So the kind of, the way that we've kind of identified the bottom line idea is that this stuff that is in storage is going to be on display as stuff in storage. And it was going to sit in a vault in a very kind of massive structure that was smooth, and it was where all the precious stuff was, and you could see it from the outside. And it would be surrounded by what we call the veil in the vault. And the veil was this very coy structure that allowed light to come in from all different sides, filtered and diffuse. But it was also brittle, and it was able to take a big structural span. So it did a lot of different things. And so these are some of the early images. And this was something that we lost at the very beginning, and I'm just, I'll always regret that we don't have our drive-in lobby, valet lobby. But basically you come in and you shoot up an escalator right through the vault, and you end up on this 1 acre of open space, column-free, and it's about 24 feet high, with light coming in from all sides. This is some of the, this is a digital model of 3D print of the geometry of the side wall kind of moving up into the skylights. And there was a lot of work done on, this is just about figuring out where direct sunlight is coming and making sure that nothing gets any direct sun with all of this exposure. And the general idea is that you shoot up, and then when you come back down, it's a loop, and you go down with some friction, and on the way down you start to see bits of the what we call pre-curated work, and it's there in racks and boxes, and you see the preparators, and you see the whatever is happening behind the scenes, but you're always aware that this is not just a museum, it's a collection. It's one man's collection, it's one man's obsession, and you have to filter what you see through that. There were some structural aspirations that we had initially around precast, about using precast concrete structurally with its 200-foot spans. And we went through a lot of pain, when we were unable to actually realize it, not because of anything about Eli Broad, but just because it's impossible to do what we wanted to do in an earthquake zone. What we did was it's a little bit different. So there's a steel armature with cast concrete cladding. But the span is still the same. It's still 200-foot spans. So these are some of the cast units, and this is a very warped fisheye. It's very flat, but it's a vast gallery, very large gallery. And this is some of the material stuff that's being prepared that's about to go on site. And the last thing I wanted to show is something that is a very different model of the way that architects perform in the world, and it's called CultureShed. And the green line that you see, the vertical line, is the High Line. It's a project that we're responsible for in New York with James Corner. On the left is the Hudson River. And the red dot on the bottom is Renzo Piano's new Whitney Museum. The red dot on the top is a new institution that we kind of gave birth to, and with David Rockwell as a strange bedfellow collaborator. So there was this is a site. It's called the Hudson Yards, and there's an eastern-western yard, and this is where all the trains from Penn Station come and dock, and it's an active site of trains, and there will be a platform built on it, and one of the, a very, very huge multi-use development is coming up there. It's like Hong Kong in Manhattan. And in that site, there was, and so we're at the very bottom, you see the High Line curves at 30th Street and goes westward. There was a site of about 21,000 square feet. The city said, it's for cultural use. Who wants to do something here? There was no institution that wanted to use it. There was no museum that wanted to expand. So we thought, well, what does New York need that it doesn't have? And first idea that came to mind is that, well, it doesn't have a Kunsthal. It doesn't have a place that it's like a non-collecting museum, a place to exhibit art, a place to exhibit art that's coming, let's say, from another place. It could be produced work, it could be co-produced, it could be just presented. There's a lot of great work that just never makes it to New York because New York's institutions are so heavy with boards and with 10-year waits to get something to show. So we thought of something that's very light on its feet. The principles we thought of as, this came from a pitch book, but it's the creative contamination is that it puts together the visual arts with the performing arts, but also with creative industry, like culinary arts and design and fashion, publishing, and so forth. So we want to foster kind of crossover without thinking of the arts as high and low, but it's all about kind of true interdisciplinarity. This is a global institution. It's brand neutral, so it's not a Guggenheim. It will clearly have its own brand, CultureShed, but it's very generic in a certain way, and it's going to count on global timeshares with other cultural institutions as well as just an open programming. It's very flexible, so it can change its footprint, and this is very important. It comes out of a time in which the economy really went bust, and a lot of funders withdrew money from various projects, and we thought, well, how could the arts be immune to the flips of the market? And so we thought that that maybe a new model would be a financially self-sustainable cultural institution, and so the idea really has to do with earning its keep, this is how it does it. Basically, it's a base building of 3 stacked gallery floors and a rooftop deck with a restaurant and bar above, and a deployable shed. And the shed doubles its footprint at the ground, and by doing so, it basically allows it to do extra large shows, and it also allows it to do art fairs and fashion week and galas and things like that where it could earn income. It uses this crane technology, which you see at all ports, and it just upgrades it. And this is, so there is this tall building that we're also doing, but here's the shed. And its walls open up, and the wall of the base building, and on grade you can have a footprint of close to I think 31,000, 32,000 square feet, and so it's totally thermally controlled, but also it can raise its walls and be open air, and it can host public events. And so this is in and out. And the programming moves from public cultural stuff to income generating, and these things start to blur after a while, but at a high level blur. So there's some more imagery. It's made of ETFE pillows. This is looking from the north. The galleries are very kind of just very simple. Shed is very large, takes all different kinds of events. This is it back nested, and when it's nested, It opens up a big plaza that also can take open-air events. And this is Fashion Week. And the various configurations, public, private, and public programming that's free to the public. So we have a whole business plan and a whole economic plan, and a whole schedule of how it can work. You know, I won't get into the design is in the process of change and transformation, but I'll only say that the project has taken hold, and the city is committed to doing this. Bloomberg announced this in his State of the City speech about a month ago, and it's transferring from being a city-protected project to a non-for-profit in which there is a board that's being formed for the capital costs. And the whole institution is actually being conceived and constructed as a building is being constructed. And this opens up a whole new agency for the architect, and that's why I wanted to end with that. Thank you. Shall we?
Kind of a whirlwind of stuff.
Can you make some sense out of all of that?
My pistons aren't firing fast enough, but maybe I'll just start with an observation, really, rather than a question, because it was something I'd never seen the work presented, those projects presented in that way. And so here are my thoughts. I think, you know, these students or a lot of these students have been working very closely with Jeff Kipnis over the last year and a half, and I think that he uses ICA as one of his sort of demonstration models. So that's a project that I think that the students here know very well, and they know it in relation to the problem of the single surface building. I believe this is the context in which he discusses that building, and also in relation to the question of architecture as visual apparatus, as optical device. So in seeing this, I thought, okay, let's not go there. Let's go someplace else. And so let me just start with 3 observations. So you began with a gadget, and you ended with a bigger gadget. I mean, I was kind of amazed by that. I was really amazed by that, and maybe before she leaves, you can take her down to the end of the hall and look at the gadgets here, because I hadn't really thought of the do-it-yourself drill in relation to contemporary robotics quite in the same way, but I thought that really could open up an interesting conversation about whether you use gadgets to design or whether the gadgets in fact become the buildings, which I think is one conversation that we see happening here. I think these are all 3 going to be related. I'm not really sure if I can.
But I take gadget as a pejorative.
Oh, no. Why?
I don't know. I mean, in what way do you mean gadget?
I just mean gadget in the hierarchy of machines. I think of robots as macho top-down machines, and I think of gadgets as more do-it-yourself, stealth, anti-institutional, operating at a different within a different cultural cadence. That's what I meant by gadget.
Okay,
I didn't mean low engine. I don't know what you thought I meant. What did you think I meant?
I don't know.
Like a consumer thing?
Yeah, well, yeah, like a disposable consumer cheapy thing. But no, keep your train of thought.
Okay. Well, all right. So that was one thing I thought. So then I thought, okay, what is the relationship of these? Okay, Banham calls them gizmos. Is that better? Not much.
Well, the reference to Banham is good.
Okay, I'll call them gizmos. So you start with institutional critique, and you end with institution building. Right? So this is another frame. So we have one kind of robot one kind of I don't know what to call it now.
Yeah,
You've like
you
made
know.
me like all fucked up and what I'm going to call this little thing. It was a drill, and then it was a big drill. Okay, so then you start with institutional critique, and you get to institution building, and that that's a kind of 180-degree flip, which I'm interested in hearing you talk a little bit more about. But I suppose the thing that really is in there, wending its way in a funny way, is the wall. And I had never really thought of the what would it mean to design a practice that's all based on a kind of attack on the wall. So you start with this real clear drilling of the wall, which is, and you were very clear that that's a military device that's shooting like bullets, in effect, dismantling this wall. So we have a wall under attack. And then the last projects are all massive. You describe them all in terms of how far they can go without any walls. So you got this floor space, square footage with no walls. Even, I don't know whether you want to get into what I'm sure is like a super painful part of the Broad thing. How does that sound?
Oh, God, I knew you would try to package this into some kind of theory, but but that's
That's what he's paying me for.
I guess I'd like to just take the first part of that for a moment, destroying walls and then destroying institutions and building institutions, and
No, institutional critique and destroying walls is slightly different.
institutional critique and
That was your term.
and institution building.
Yeah.
Right, and so, and that is really a kind of a personal arc in a kind of strange way. It's not to say that the institutional critique is over, that continues. I mean, I do think that the CultureShed is an institutional critique, and we try not to use the word institution when we talk about it, but we don't have a word. But I guess when in my past it was a way to have a voice. The voice was from the outside, and it was kind of easier to lob grenades from the outside at something, right? And and the moment that so being a guest on invitation to a gallery or a museum, it was kind of an easy target to accept the invitation and then to launch into a critique. And I think that a lot of people, before me did that. And so I've learned that from a bunch of people like Hans Hake and others. When at some point, the museum, the very thing that was the object of the critique, asked us to actually speak in their voice. That was the ICA, and it was the first time that we had to really stand back and say, there was a generational change. People like me came into power, and they were institution builders, directors, and they were interested in what I had to say and what Rick had to say and Charles and so forth. So, and that was really eye-opening because we got very familiar and comfortable with being outsiders. At the moment that there was this generational shift and people were aligned politically, it was destabilizing all of a sudden. Well, what is it that we had to critique? And so therefore we started to think in a very constructive way. And so in a certain way, the ICA has ideas, but they're not like critiques of the institution. What we did there was, we wanted to make as much space public as possible. We played with it where that edge was, in that moment where you paid, your fees to get into the museum. But besides that, it was kind of working with certain conventions of gallery and the whole system of the way that museums work. And the program that we got was not that different from many contemporary art museums that are being built. So I think that they're probably very, very similar. It's like 1/3 gallery space, to 1/3 income-producing space, and you have to build that in to a museum in order to sustain it these days. That was in 2000, the year 2000, I think, that we got that commission, or a little later. But so that, like, just to bring us to today, how do you think about sustaining the institution, right? Is it the same model? And for us, the notion of not making not making a building as a kind of inheritance to somebody else's program, but actually programming a building, and making an architecture that does something that has a different kind of performance value, where it can be much more adaptable to many things. Still not without an image, but the notion of building this thing that could help artists, that would free this new thing, this new being, from the confines of the the guys that write the $100 million checks, right? That get to say which blockbuster show they want, right? So it was really to find curatorial freedom and to find a different kind of functionality. So that's where the institution building comes from. I don't know if that makes any sense, that arc. Sort of.
No. It makes sense. I'm trying to.
You want it to be about architecture. Walls.
Well, I'm trying to figure out how you turn institutional critique into an architectural project. I mean, that does not seem to me a super easy or a self-evident thing to do. And I think that the ICA is definitely the moment in which the studio has to face that kind of transformation. And I'm just figuring out what the vocabulary, I think that, we've a little bit had this conversation before. I think one of the ways that people think about the ICA is as, and I have thought about it, maybe incorrectly, but as a series of installations strung, so in fact, not really making a radical change from what had gone on before, but using a kind of invisible building armature to thread together things that you can imagine operating as quasi-autonomous installations, a little bit like the plan of the Whitney show. So you have the wall which stands for architecture in some way, that is under fire, that is disappearing. I think that's the way you described it, right?
The ICA?
No. At the Whitney. If you take the Whitney plan of the show as a diagram for a way of thinking about architecture, you would look at that diagram and you would say that there is a wall that holds together a series of installation projects, which in their combined action over time have as their long-term goal the dismantling of the wall itself. That's the narrative of that show, which I think you can then map onto the ICA as well. And is that a friendly amendment or not?
I know, I have no idea, but how do you make the connection to the ICA?
Because you have the wall now not going vertically, but the wall as the single surface that is the armature for the intense media, these moments of architectural intensity that you can imagine extrapolating in some way.
I don't see it that way at all. But it's like, these things are more interesting when people kind of interpret them in different ways. The way it was, conceived was as a kind of fluid. It was, a part of that continuous thing, which I'm trying to get out of my system, by the way. Like, one has to go through that period, but there was, and I think that there was a kind of politic attached to it around the extension of public space, and being able to kind of produce space without the need to erect it, with walls, right? So it was through a surface that kind of, and I think it was also for us a hangover from the I-beam show, which was a fluid kind of single surface condition which combed together two populations and was really about two buildings intertwined. But with this project, it was more about public and about folding the public up through the building, and then the box sits on top of it. It's always the way we thought about it. I don't think about it as a series of installations. I think of the building itself as a kind of apparatus that has a kind of cinematographic role, and when you're here, we imagined it. As you ascend, there are different effects that happen. There are different ways that the site is brought to you, but it's kind of assembled, and it's also dispensed in a very particular way. But I never think about it as a series of insertions.
I'm sure you don't.
I know, but you do
I'm
clearly.
I'm totally sure you don't. I want to maybe move away from the specifics of the projects that you showed just for a moment and ask you a couple questions that I've actually never asked you before, which is that did you intend to be an architect?
Oh, wow. No, it was like the last thing on my mind. I wanted to be a photographer and a filmmaker. That's kind of, and I was at Cooper Union, and I was studying. I was in the art school. I took architecture just on a lark. I took architectonics because I didn't know what it meant as a class. And then I came into contact with John Haydock, who is this larger-than-life character who spoke in riddles, and I was really fascinated by him, and I was fascinated by what was going on in the school. There was a discourse there around architecture, and was better and was more interesting than what was going on in the art school at the time. And so I thought, I will, let's say I'll just take a couple more classes out. Then I decided to transfer, and I have to say that my parents, old world European parents, wanted me to be an architect, and I, for that reason, if nothing else, I didn't want to be an architect. So when I decided,
why did they want you to be an architect?
Because they thought it was
job security.
Well, yeah, it was like a professional way to channel your artistic ideas, and you could make a living. They were so wrong. I should have been an artist.
You're doing all right.
But so when I graduated, and I invited them to graduation, I didn't tell them I was graduating in architecture. I never wanted to give them the satisfaction of knowing that I had transferred, and then I got this degree in architecture, and they were very stunned. But still, I had no intention of being an architect. I just had a degree, and then we started to do the installation. So, in my mind, what had happened was I started to think in 3D, and that was a big change. And I started to get interested in with Rick in doing things in public space, never with the intention of having clients and working with working in the profession. In fact, I thought the profession was intellectually bankrupt, and it was totally corrupt. And so I wanted to be as far away from it as possible. But we.
And now?
Absolutely. No. I think it's changed over the years. I mean, this was like in the '80s. It was really pretty bad, pretty sad. And people that were doing interesting things were doing a work on paper, right? Either publishing or working in galleries.
And now you're working with the Eli Broad.
Yeah. Yeah, so you want me to talk about that?
Well, yeah. I mean, I know that you've
I have to be careful because anything could be blogged here, and he is definitely in the news.
Well, I mean, I know that you've remarked in public on a truism about, not a truism, but a thing that is commonly stated, that architects do their worst building for Eli. And I wonder what your thoughts about that are. I mean, I know you've thought about it.
Yeah,
but-
you know, I think that's what Nikolai's, I don't remember who said that. Somebody wrote that. I think it was with Renzo Piano's LACMA building. You know, Eli over the years has done a bunch of architectural projects with different people. There was a Zaha building that just opened in Michigan, and you know, I don't think Eli was very involved in it, contributed to it. This is a very particular project for him. This is his collection. It's kind of, you know, it means something for him at this point in his life, and I think it's different from the other projects that he's been involved with. So for that alone, I think that he is maybe more cautious and careful, and he's listening a little harder. And I think that in this building, you know, we weren't able to realize everything that we wanted, but I think we're still going to be realizing a lot of stuff that we wanted. I don't think, you know, this is like, is this our worst building? It's a hard thing to, I don't know if I could answer that question. I hope that, you know, I mean, I don't even think of the buildings that way, but I feel proud of what I think is going to be there, and I think it's going to be a very good building. And I think that he has, you know, he's been a decent client, actually. And he, you know, anything that truly, truly mattered, he has defended. So.
I guess part of what I was asking, so you decided, you lied to your parents at graduation about becoming an architect. There's some kind of life lesson in there for all of you. I'm not quite sure what it is, but lying to your parents is probably generally a good thing after a certain age. But there is there is a sense that by the time you get to projects like the ones that you're dealing with now, that there's a tremendous amount more negotiation with a larger number of factors than there are when you're doing installations at the beach. And so I think of lying to your parents as the first lesson in the art of negotiation with forces that are bigger than yours. That bigger than you are. I suppose that's a little bit what I'm what I'm thinking about, but I'm also, you know, thinking about how you construct a practice and how you exert those kinds of controls, how you manage those kinds of negotiations, and I'm curious about, at this point, since you have, you know, so many projects and are winning lots of competitions. I mean, I know it never feels like enough, but you are, let me tell you. And I wonder whether you're in the position now, I'm sure you are, of turning projects down, which I don't think everybody gets to. I think you have, I would imagine, have gotten there. And I'm curious about what your criteria are, like why you would turn some down and not others. Like, what is that like?
Mm-hmm. Well, you know, it's not as rosy as it seems. I have to say that architects have to compete for everything, and these days, and it's pretty brutal. You know, the math on it just simply doesn't work. You know, you put so much resource into every competition, and then you win. You know, maybe a fraction of them if you're very lucky, and whatever profit. I hate to say this to a group of young architects, because it sound very cynical, but you know, then whatever profits are made in getting one of those projects are eaten up by the overhead in having done so there's something wrong with the system that makes you still compete. And you know, even Frank Gehry still competes, and you know, I think he does it maybe more for sport. But some of us just do it because that's the only way to get good projects. In terms of the criteria, we talk about that a lot in the studio, and there are some commercial projects that come our way that we have to evaluate. I think that the criteria used to be keeping our hands clean, and you know, doing something that's commercial is necessarily bad, and the experiment could only be had, on a smaller project or a more independent project or cultural project. I don't know, my world is changing a lot, and I don't think, I used to think in a very reductive way, and I think maybe in a kind of more messy way now. Just to go back to a point that you made around, negotiation, Lincoln Center is the best example of negotiation. It was so incredibly complex. There were so many stakeholders. We had to convince so many people, and we had to speak in so many voices to be able to convince so many people to do the right thing. And at first I thought of it as like, the cliche 1% creativity and 99% sweat or whatever, perspiration and to inspiration. I realized that 99% of perspiration is as creative as that 1%, and to be able to pull off something in a city, in an urban context with such complexity, to be able to understand how to work the networks, and in the end to get what you want or close to what you want, is something that is gives me a lot of satisfaction. And now working on less complex projects just feels too easy. But there are different experiments at different scales, and we're working on 2 operas. We're working on small
set design.
We're actually creating from scratch, like another startup, an opera from scratch with collaborators and a site and an open air site. We're doing a lot of different things, and it's our work, I think, has splintered in many directions. It's not that it's eliminated, like the small projects are eliminated by the bigger ones. They continue. They're just different trajectories, and they fold on each other. And I think that the project that I would just edit out and filter out is a project that doesn't allow us to be amused. It doesn't allow us to think creatively. So doing the same thing twice, or working in a context where so doing something that I don't know how to do is the most interesting thing, and that's part of the criteria, is like getting ourselves into a big heaping mess of trouble and then trying to dig our way out of it. The CultureShed is a case in point. We didn't know what the fuck we were doing. We put this thing forward, and then all of a sudden it took hold, and now it's being taken really seriously, and it has to function. And I'm not talking about technically function. It has to function as an organization. We have to find a director, some kind of cultural entrepreneur that could put together the arts and these other enterprises. There's no such person. We can't even imagine what that person is. With many of our projects, we kind of jump out of the plane without a parachute, and we kind of figure it out on the way down. That's the criteria. It has to keep us jumping.
I'm going to ask 2 last questions and then open it up to conversation with the students. You consistently refer to the office as a studio, and in a culture in which the word lab has become a really dominant model for thinking about where architects produce work. And if we keep in mind the idea that where architects produce work, how they conceive of where they produce work really shapes the way they conceive of the work itself and how it moves through the world. I wonder whether you could talk a little bit about what it means to work in a studio. Like, what's a studio?
What's a studio? Wow. I never really thought about it. That word just comes unconsciously. Our setup, we have about 85 people or so. It's a lot of people. We never imagined having more than like 5, and then it just kept growing. We're immensely inefficient, basically. Rick and Charles and I are our principals, But, there are project leaders, and it's top-down and bottom-up. And it's the projects are very collaborative in that, young kids have as much kind of to say as anybody else. And the person with the best ideas wins usually, and sometimes it's very messy and nasty, and nobody's polite to one another. But I think that there's a kind of search for something ineffable. There's no obvious way to do something, to solve a problem, or to create a problem. It's always that thing that, and you can't transmit that, you can't explain that to anyone, but you kind of hope that it rubs off, that you're trying to find something. You know it when you hit it, and you keep trying. And that's why I say it's absolutely inefficient, because we can plan a project to be, a schematic design phase to be 4 months long, but who's to say in 4 months you can get an idea? And so you're necessarily kind of, we have to work within those kinds of constraints, but it makes it very, very difficult. And that's why it's like, for me, architecture is a pleasure and a great deal of pain. And I can't imagine it without that pain, because you're always like, the clock is expiring. You're working within these kind of constructs that you necessarily have. The overhead at my studio that we have to build, we have to produce X amount of income per month to be able to keep everyone going. And how do you do that and still be happy with yourself and not do anything that you don't want to be doing, just to keep the engines going? So I do feel that we've been really privileged, because we've never taken on a project that we didn't want to do. And we do a lot of, I wish we could do more things that we want to do and we don't get to do, but we've never been forced to take anything on. And there are other things.
You mean for money?
Well, for money, yeah, for money and for fame or power or anything like that. I have no grand illusions of building big, having a bigger studio or doing bigger stuff. It's not about bigness. It's really about the challenge. It could be tiny.
One might think of the studio in relation to the artist studio as opposed to the professional office. I mean, that would be a clear antecedent for the use of that term. But there's also the studiolo, the place that you work by yourself, often in a domestic context, where the studio used to be, indistinguishable. But I suppose the easiest etymological jump is to the idea of study, and to the notion of design as a form of research, which is another sort of buzzword today. So I wonder are you interested in this term of research, or might we say instead, what is the role of teaching and research in your office? You've been working on thesis at Princeton. Liz has run thesis at Princeton around single word themes. Some of them that I remember are fat, beauty, democracy, and I think the current one is action.
Call to action.
She slipped in a couple of extra words there at the end. So I wonder whether you could talk about research and action, or how those things go together a little bit, and then we'll open it up. I think every project is a kind of moment, a kind of arbitrary moment in time where you get a chance to do something, and very often you're just like a speck. You arrive there. There's the world has preceded you. There's a lot, a particular program or site. There's a lot to learn from identifying a point in time on a project. So research is built into every project always. How deep do you go, and in what directions? We're very interested in. We're interested in rethinking the institution and the history of it. Any particular kind of program. We're interested in the role of technology in relationship to architecture, through the 20th century and into the next. And how do you, as an architect, how do you rethink, certain conventions of
the relationship between technology and architecture. We're interested in, there are many researchers that continue to move and thread through our work. Visuality is one that it has penetrated nearly every project, but the culture of vision is really complicated, and it has very different twisting pieces. So, I would say there's not, if you asked if there's a sustained research or a sustained project, and there's a kind of aesthetic to it, I would say no. There's not a single sustained project, and our work changes. It's morphing all the time, and we're constantly in search of a vocabulary and looking for a vocabulary that kind of emerges out of a project. So we're not really fixed on anything particular, but there are certain things that are recurring, and it can't help. It's just the intersection of your brain with any set of circumstances. So I value research. I think of teaching as an extension of my work. It's not just here I go to the studio and here I go to teach students. It's very contiguous. However, I don't bring my work to my students. I don't literally. I like to think through with them their work creatively. So putting topics on the table that are that may be specific to the moment, topical or urgent, is interesting for me. And so when I start to think about well, why do I give these themes? Well, how can I justify them? It's usually something that I'm struggling with in some way, but it's not necessarily in the work. And it's something that I'm trying to figure out what other people can make of it. So this call to action really comes out of trying to understand how people of this generation, of the students that are here, what they think is urgent, and how architecture can be relevant to anyone outside of us, speaking to ourselves. And call to action does kind of somehow connect with 60s activism, but, one could think of that transhistorically, and coming to today, and the some things came alive in the last couple of years, where there has been a kind of bigger consciousness of politics. Is there a role for architecture in politics? Or it doesn't really need to be political. What is it that's urgent for architecture? And so deliberately, I want to see which way the students are blowing. And, they're having a really hard time. I have to say, they have beliefs, but they don't know how to, it's not so easy to translate those beliefs into an architectural project. It's scary.
Anybody have particular questions about any of these projects or other ones? I mean, we've a little bit been all over the place. Give you a minute to think about it. I don't know. Is action, or is politics, you think, an issue that is back at the school here?
I mean, it would be good if the students would respond to some of this while they're warming up. There's a kind of very appealing, I don't want to say whether it's genuine or disingenuous, frankness about the way you talk about the work, and kind of plausible uncertainty. And it would have been interesting, I don't know all of it so well, it would be interesting to see, for example, if it takes 4 months before somebody rings the bell in schematic design, what the other prospects were and how you move toward a certain conclusion. Meaning, if ever in the discourse there were the antithetical arguments, and how you either reconcile them or dump them.
Mm-hmm.
So there is always a discussion when you put work up about whether you show, this is because you show a little sketch, you got this, and you got this, and that's what we did. And it's extremely clear and very precise, but the way you talk about it is quite different. So it would be interesting to see how that was processed, not every scrap, but what sort of chronology is probably the wrong word, because it maybe implies something which is step by step, but maybe sort of jumping around. It would be interesting for me to see some of that. The other thing I was looking for was some kind of affiliations. I think you started to talk about some kind of affiliations, some kind of allegiances. I don't know whether you know that Jim Sterling piece in Hasselmere, the Olivetti thing, where the window cleaner goes back and forth over the roof. It's, you know?
I don't know.
It was done for Olivetti. I don't know. It's an edition, actually, but a number of years ago, but it was published a lot. But the mechanics of it, you know, this sort of fandom of mechanics and what it does. So there's that big, you know, kind of a spiderish piece, and it moves back and forth on the roof of this glass link. There's an old building, and then there's a link, and then there are two blocks where the offices are. And it reminded me a little bit of that. I was trying to understand whether your interests run in that direction, and they do, and then they with the piece next to the High Line, which rolls in and out, and the drill, which goes around and around. So there's some of that, but it's not clear that it's an allegiance. Oh, I'm wondering what would happen if did the wall fall down?
The wall, no, it kind of semi-disintegrated, but it didn't fall.
Because if it falls down, then the drill falls down and is destroyed. And if you wanted to chase back to the point that Sylvia was trying to make you a defiler of institutions, so you not only the wall came down, drill came down, and the whole thing ended as a kind of cataclysm. It didn't come to that.
No, it would be, well, it wouldn't be holding anything up other than the drill. But, you know, if it had gone long enough, it would have done that.
So the implication was?
Yeah, there would be, it kind of suggests that that it would undo itself. But, you know, just to come back to, I don't know, your question was circular also. I wanted to just, you know, maybe even touch on a little bit about methodology, you know, like what are all these things that get rejected or the counter arguments or whatever. That's why I took the question. I don't know, there's something in the end, as much as I say that, you know, we're interested in research and that sometimes we do very, very kind of orderly research. We look at things historically, and then we try multiple strategies, and we have a discussion, you know, and we are able to articulate thoughts and experiments. Very often, you know, stuff comes out of total whim and intuition, and it has no bearing on anything that came before it. And you know, I admit that, you know, that there's a fair amount of that in the work. You know, it's like something that was just, and I don't say whimsically, it's just something that just came out of outer space, you know, like it just hits you and you know it. And so I'm just, you know, speaking to intuition and into sensibilities and all that. In terms of allegiances, you know, I guess I came out of the Hayduckian thing, you know, I mean, you know, if I look back, well, who were my influences? You know, I think that people that were doing installation art, you know, and maybe even before that, Duchamp, you know, and work that was kind of already anti-institutional and kind of breaking out of the gallery walls, stuff in the 70s you know, that really defied the walls of the institution, but was art practice, was really more what was interesting than architects and architecture. And that's where, you know, when you ask about the past, ever want to be an architect, I also, there was no one that I specifically admired, and there was not a single experience architecturally that I said, wow, this is so incredible that I have to do something like this. So I never had that moment. And I came into architecture really kind of just on the side, it just happened almost by attrition, or I didn't, I started to produce things. But what I think that the Hayduckian upbringing gave me, that was my brush with someone important in architecture at the time, it was a kind of ethics, a sense of ethics around, in a sense, architecture's autonomy from everything else. Like it, and it didn't want to touch the profession, and wanted to be free of all of that, and it wanted to kind of script itself, and at the same time maybe touch other disciplines, but the valve had to be turned on and off. And so I think that, there's a kind of pedigree there, but that's kind of as far as it went. And a Cooper education meant that you were able, certain books were on the okay list, and certain books were, absolutely, you just couldn't be caught dead carrying Venturi's Complexity and Contradiction. You would be actually expelled. I had one in my drawer, and I would take it out and look at it, and I found that inspirational when I was a student. But
it's so funny. I don't think I've ever heard you use a word like inspirational before. It's so poetic.
Well, but that's
you had inspiration.
Yeah. Is that? I think that's a good thing.
No, it's just you're portraying more of your Cooper roots, and I've seen, than I've seen, which is interesting. It's great.
It's not black or white. It's just mushy.
But
there is something about Hayduck it's not only architecture qua architecture, but there's something introverted that architecture belongs to itself, but also inscrutable. And if you dial it back one step, it has something to do with an idea about life itself as a person, and meanings, or the elusiveness of meanings, or that it's your job to go find out the meaning, and if you happen to stumble into it, nobody else will make the same stumble. In a way, there's something which is very personal and very idiosyncratic. And if you looked at it in that way, then an instinctive adversarial relationship to other kinds of social and political organizations would come out of that, it seems to me, because they represented a more extroverted way of making decisions. It was interesting to hear you talk about, the 99 and the 1. Which I think wasn't Romney, but the 99 has utility, and it has art in it, which I'm not sure I ever learned, and although I can learn to appreciate it, I think that's an unusual point made here, that the capacity to facilitate also counts. Otherwise, you win it and you don't build it.
Yeah. Well, it's those points are really, they're really connected. That when I go back to Hayduck, what was insisted on in that education was originality, right? Every person was, you couldn't do a Hayduck wall house. You couldn't do it. You would be, again, he would ostracize you. Before him, and Rick's education, for example, there was the Misesian approach, there was the Korb approach, there was the Wright approach, there was the Alto approach. It was you picked a way, right? And it was you were like of that brain set. And with Hayduck, every person had to do their thing. Architecture was autonomous from everything else, and each person was an individual artist. And you couldn't copy anybody else, And so if your work remotely looked like anything else, you were ostracized. But this kind of uncompromising attitude really did produce a resentment. I think from me, my very first project at Cooper, which was a 9-square grid, like Solowit thing, that everyone had to work with that. I fur-lined that 9-square grid, and I gave it, and I got called into the dean's office. But and I just thought it was a provocation because I didn't want to be taught by a system. I was just very allergic to that. But it was itself. It was like that. Learning through that, but then learning to be autonomous and learning to be your own voice, your own individual voice, was a system, was another system that needed to be resisted. And I think that, after that, I just, it was a kind of extreme approach that was very much my formation that I think without it, there's no way I would have been interested in architecture without the Hayek influence. But after that, it taught me to keep an arm's distance from him, and I was able to, in the next years, move on to do things without psychoanalysis. And I was like one of the few people that graduated there that didn't really need a shrink. But anyway, it's all connected. It's really about this kind of wanting to have a voice, but also understanding that you have to manipulate a lot of things, and you have to put yourself in the thick of complex situations, and you can't really be autonomous. How do you keep your voice and kind of move to the middle some way that you can actually have an effect on things rather than talk to yourself?
It's at least conceivable that they come to you. As opposed to you being in the middle. Or you go to
Yeah, let's try.
But there would be another way to track all of this also. I mean, because I was writing down wall house here because I'm thinking about walls obviously today, and if you're going to resist Hayek, I mean, his most sort of profound architectural project on some level is to reduce everything about the field, in fact, to the wall. So if you take on the wall in the context of Cooper, you take on architecture itself. So, I think that the wall is this, semiotically, symbolically, and structurally, is one of architecture's most important episodes, let's say. And, I'm very distracted by those wall panels that are up there, those little bits of things. And I'm thinking about how the journey the wall has taken through, Diller Scofidio to those walls, and trying to think about the kind of oxymoron of taking, say, the museum without walls, which is a fundamentally anti-architectural idea, and to take that project on as an architect. How do you build a museum without walls? In the profound sense, seems to me a really interesting challenge. And if you then were to do a material history of your walls, you would find them now meeting up with new kinds of walls that this generation is producing that are thick, that they have a whole different kind of quality. And I guess what I'm trying to understand is whether, like in your first wall, the robot, the drill, left a trace of its action on that wall, right? It was a diagram of the action of the drill over the course of the thing. So I'm trying to figure out what trace this wall, from the wall house to the thick, single surface, computer-generated wall of today, does that contemporary wall, has it produced amnesia? I think that for me that's the issue. Those walls present themselves as having forgotten their sojourn in the period of institutional critique and the call to action of the 60s and so forth, and enter the world with an apparently different kind of etiology. And I think that they become much more interesting if they hook back up. So your walls that are not really walls. They're not defilers. I didn't mean to suggest that they were defilers in that way, but I think that they are walls that that structure a notion of the discipline that's really very different than the one that we think we're building. And I don't know whether I think that that's about originality and inspiration, but it is definitely about the question of what sort of agency do we want these walls to have now. I mean, I don't know, you're looking at me like I'm making absolutely no sense at all, but maybe I'm not, which
It's
is...
fun watching you make thoughts.
No, but I mean, you know, compare those
You talking about the
things,
quilted thing?
those quilted thingamajigs, which I don't, again, I'm using, not gadgets, those quilted pieces of wall, you compare those quilted pieces of wall with the wall behind the Duchamp, and there is a kind of history of architecture that's embedded there that tells you a lot about the state of the field. And anyway, that was the wall becomes much more interesting the more work that it does. The more we understand its relationship to institutions, to form, to technology, et cetera. And I guess that's really all I was trying to say, that it's more interesting that way. Anyway, have you guys warmed up? Do you have a question in the back there?
Question here.
How do you factor in time into wow, well, I mean, I think it's always there, you know, it's a dimension that you're always imagining. You know, architecture, the kind of dumb response to that is that architecture is always around cycles, you know, it's always around you know, the 50-year, you know, the 100-year flood and the 50-year whatever, the 50-year building and the 10-year warranty and the, you know, the seasonal thing and so forth. So there's always, time is always a part of what you think about. I think that you know, the way that we think about space and buildings is very much as animated by stuff, and so we never think of frozen objects. We don't really think about projects that way. So temporality is very, very much built into the work and the way it's seen and understood and experienced. And like we're talking about the ICA being a kind of cinematic experience. I think it is very much you know, a part of just the everyday for us, and something as dumb. This is also a dumb way of answering the question with CultureShed. It's all about, you know, its whole economy and its whole livelihood and the way that it sees shows and lengths of shows and experiences and, you know, 1 hour slots and, you know, 2-week slots and so forth. Very much built into that project. But I would say the one thing that I kind of lust after, that I feel like if I could do something different from what I'm doing, I would want to make a feature-length movie because I have, you know, I don't feel like I've ever dealt with like a 90-minute time frame in a very intricate way, and I would really love to do that and just screw, you know, the third dimension and just go straight into the fourth. And I think that's, you know, but anyway, it's part of the work.
So you still want to be a filmmaker?
I do. I want.
This is, I guess, slightly related to I guess, your interest in film, but I'm wondering in your drawings and representation, and maybe throughout your career, it seems like there's been an interest in using the drawing medium to explore the stuff you're interested in, visuality, domesticity, and there used to be at least a lot more kind of gadgetry that's represented, that used to be represented in the drawings. But
Mhm.
I don't know how that's changed or how you see the impact.
Yeah. Well, you know, there's the sketchbook stuff, which I don't know how anyone lives without a sketchbook. You know, it's very natural to me to think through drawings, and I think through sections. You know, and it's kind of a big question mark to me how. You know, everyone in our studio, most people don't sketch. Most people just go straight to, you know, modeling an idea. Like, and it feels so cumbersome to me to do that. So there's something about just one's thinking process, and you know, I was probably wired to think in section. So a lot of the drawings, and maybe that's connected or not connected, but we valued hand drawings a lot in the formative period, and we drew, and the drawings were not only a way to get at ideas, but they were like manifestations of ideas, and some drawings led to built projects, and some built projects led to drawings, and the drawings were alternative manifestations of the same project that was built. And so we never really looked at, you know, any kind of value, you know, between the drawing and the thing. I think that, you know, part of, you know, maybe if I had a complaint to make about the way things are done today, there's such an emphasis on simulation, you know, and simulation is kind of by nature not as good as the thing. You know, and it sets up that problem, and it puts drawing in a certain way, you know, in a position on the way to the thing, as opposed to just an alternative, you know, an alternative way to express the same thing. So, you know, I think about a book that way also. So you do a project, and you do a book, and the book is not just a demonstration of the project. It's a project that has maybe a pretext of showing something that's built, but it's its own thing. So I think that we have so many different tools, and I would you know, feel very sad, you know, if people kind of lost touch with certain drawing instruments. And you're right, you know, there's kind of gadgetry in, you know, parallel rule and you know, a triangle. You open it and close it, and then we made instruments that actually drew the drawings that they were part of. And we made models that kind of deconstructed themselves, and so this was very much a part of a self-reflection on the instruments as part of the idea.
But part of the question I thought also was, now that the drawings are gadget made, that's where you went, right? Now that the drawings are gadget made, what are the instruments of those forms of self-reflection now?
Right. Yeah, I guess the right answer would be that gadgets don't make ideas, right? It's still the creative person that's doing that digital model is still making every single choice. So maybe it's not such a bad thing, you know, that. But you know, the way I just like to, you know, break things and cut things up, and you know, it's still very old-fashioned. It's not, you know, maybe it's not that different. We have just more things to play with, you know, more toys, I guess, and more ways to look at things. But in the end, I always boil it down to, you know, like the sketch section is almost like a fundamental, you know, root of an idea, and that's where a lot of stuff comes back. And I think if I could summarize every project with a section.
After the fact?
After the fact, probably different than the original.
I find this part of the conversation kind of, I mean, it's not really a question, it's more like a comment. Because there's something interesting about this thing about, because I would argue that in your early work, I mean, what I would call it, let's say, the analog process and so on, particular installation, I remember seeing the Whitney exhibition and so on. There was something really interesting because the way that you talk about with so much care and love about the things, but the outcome of that for me was completely almost inhuman and soulless and detached. And I'm saying this as a compliment, not as a bad thing. And there was kind of almost like a contradictory mechanism in which the outcome of that production was almost detached from that kind of emotional connection. And I would argue that in some of the recent work, which seems to be going the opposite way, there's certain, I don't know, maybe it's the complexity and the dirtiness with coming and doing the buildings and so on. This seems to have, like, the work reclaims a sense of humanism that to me the early work didn't have. So to me there is something really interesting about what you're just talking about, almost the opposite. And again, it's not really a question, but it's more like a comment, and I find that like a really interesting problem in terms of what you were talking about, the autonomy. There is a certain sense that maybe in the closest, the closer that you keep the process how you produce it, maybe produce a more detached result than almost the opposite. And maybe I'm completely wrong in my perception, but there's something about that that I find kind of fascinating in the way that this part of the conversation.
Interesting. I have to think about that. Yeah, I mean, also, you know, it's the trajectory of the work is, I didn't show, there are many things that, you know, if the theme had been slightly different, I would have shown a different grouping of things. But I think that there's been a kind of interest in nothingness. You know, there's like another theme that's, you know, that is totally, if you talk about soullessness and, you know, lack of, like, absence of signature and absence of, you know, as much as possible absence of the artist.
It takes a lot of work. And
it takes a
Yeah, but that's also why it was so strange for me to hear you say things like inspiration and origin, which are quite opposed to the affectless and the dehumanized position.
Yeah, but you know, it's just like you know, it's just, you smoke some pot and you get an idea, and it's like, wow, that's inspiration. You know, that's still a part of, you know, of the way, you know, that.
Especially like the Broad Project, because it's all legal here now.
Right, but you know, I mean, it's not divine inspiration. It's just like having a hot thought, you know, and you know, it's not linear. I mean, that's what I'm just getting at. That it's a kind of admission that not everything comes out of research. It doesn't all come out of you know, a process that makes sense. You know, and it somehow, you know, it's hard to look at it backwards and put it all in order and figure out how the next thing comes out. But anyway, I don't want to make a big deal of it. And I'm not, you know, I did react badly towards paedonym poetry, you know, but there was still some things that he made that made me like, you know, it's very difficult to even articulate it, but something that it just sends you.
But it's a really interesting question. If you put your observation together with the question that was being posed before, which is to say that at an earlier period, you had lavishly handmade images of machines, which produced, at least for Hernan, a form of evacuation of subjectivity, to use a kind of art historical vocabulary, right? And what I understood you to be saying is that the literal artistic connection between hand and paper through instrument has now been severed by virtue not only by virtue of the arrival in the office of computers, by which I mean not just the machines, but the people who run them for you, right? So and that's why you said you produce ideas, which means you don't have to touch anything to do what you do. And yet it's producing form that seems to have in it a kind of affective sensibility that was absent in the material that you actually touched. So I thought that that's what you were both driving at in different ways, and trying to think about then the instruments of production today, which have new forms of alienation built into them, and yet lead to forms that are associated with a new vocabulary of affect. I don't think we'd call it poetic or anything like that, but that they have a kind of material presence that is hard to be as detached from as before. I mean, I don't know whether that's actually what you were asking, but it's, you know, it's an interesting question, and the only piece that I would add, I don't know what you would say about this, is that the one thing that's a little bit missing is the role of those early machines. The role they played not as dehumanizers, but almost as avatars. So, like if you think about the robot show, I don't know if you know that one, but like it was in you saw it very briefly, but all of the robots in the sandwich, sort of at eye level, doing a kind of Jacques Tati playtime thing. They were I don't know how to put it, but they were not scary drones with no sensibility. They were robots chasing each other, trying to look up each other's skirts. I mean, they were a kind of mechanical ballet in the Bauhausian sense of the term that was full of the effort to produce affect around machines. So there is a kind of link, I would think. I don't know, do you touch machines in the office? It seems like a really intimate question, like just what is it that you touch with your hands?
It's interesting that you made that formulation that we don't touch things, you know? I mean, if you don't make models, basically
you don't touch things.
Touch things, right? But, you know, I cannot think that the analog to the digital and the kind of what we thought of as technology back then, you know, the technologies that we were dealing with were surveillance cameras and
They were kind of quaint.
I know, they seem quaint, you know, but because at that point, we thought that surveillance was a bad thing. Right now, you know, we want cameras everywhere, right? We're most comfortable where the cameras are. And it's, you know, reality TV is always here, everywhere. I don't know, I think that there's something to be said about, you know, what machines were, you know, like, whatever, 40 years ago, and the hardware is progressively becoming smaller and smaller to a point where interfaces are more, you know, they're less present. And, you know, and maybe there's something really to that we lost that relationship with mechanical stuff. Although CultureShed is about as big a, you know, a big toy mechanical thing as you can get, you know, like a building role. But by the way, I just did want to mention that someone said something about, you know, that the High Line is very much around the specificity of being on Hudson Yards and being part of the High Line. There's tracks everywhere, so there's a little bit of kind of using movement there and referencing, you know, the site. But anyway, I don't know how to decode the question. I think it's more of it's an interesting observation. I'm not sure I have an answer to it. I don't think our work was necessarily alienating or, you know, I think we were more in a kind of, we acted more in a critical capacity before, and there's a point at which we were unsatisfied with that role and decided to be more generative without losing our criticality. And I don't know whether that has any relationship to whatever that mood is of the work, alienating or human, but, you know, that might have something to it as well.
Well, I'm going to draw this to a close unless there's anything urgent, but I think that I would say in addition to thank you. The 90-minute feature film seems like kind of a relic. And maybe like a YouTube TV show?
Series.
Series,
Right,
short,
Short, but that you can watch in one 12-hour.
or something. Yes, I think back to the question about time. You could work out your question about time in the wall by thinking about different kinds of contemporary filmic media. I would definitely come to watch one of those, see what you do. Thank you all for coming.